Okay, guys, welcome to my first attempt at this online video PowerPoint. We'll be doing the civil rights movement at the very beginning of it in the early 50s and early 60s. Now, today for this assignment is I want to make sure you guys are taking notes with your hands. So in your notebook, make sure you guys are doing Cornell notes. And on the right side, you're writing down the notes in red on the right, and on the left, make sure you answer the questions in blue. Now, what I want you guys to do is when I give you a question in blue, I want you to first stop the video, write down the answer yourself. I'm going to give you the answer anyways, and you can copy that down afterwards if you want. When we're done with the whole lecture here, you're going to take those answers in blue and write them down on the Google Doc on Canvas, guys, and that will be your assignment to make sure that you guys completed this PowerPoint presentation. All right, so with that, let's try this out and see how it goes. So today, what we're looking for on our FLT is given that African Americans have been denied equal rights since the end of Reconstruction shortly after the Civil War, when the federal government left the South, leaving blacks to live under the rule of racist state governments in the South. Students are going to examine the reasons why the civil rights movement began in the 1950s. Why did it take 80 years for some kind of movement to begin to give blacks the rights that they earned during Reconstruction? And you'll explain the importance of the early civil rights victories, demonstrated through a short response question, which will be done after the second lecture, guys. For today, just turn in the questions in blue. Now, essential questions to ponder. Do not worry about answering these on a piece of paper, but just think about them. Make sure you know what you can identify and define Great Migration, Jim Crow, Plessy versus Ferguson, and Brown versus the Board of Education. Also, make sure you can explain how events like the Great Migration and Emmett Till jump-started the civil rights movement, and evaluate if Brown versus the Board of Education was instrumental in ending segregation in the South. Okay? Now, civil rights in the 1950s. What is going to be something that's going to help jumpstart the civil rights movement? Well, keep this in mind. You have the Great Migration. Blacks are moving out of the South into cities in the West and the North. In World War One, it was Chicago, Detroit, New York City. In World War Two, it was on the West Coast of cities like Los Angeles and Oakland. Now, keep this in mind, right? Is that it's only in the South where you have Jim Crow laws, segregation laws that separate blacks and whites in public places, schools, restaurants, theaters, bathrooms, etc. That's only in areas you see in green there, and that is the white water fountain, colored water fountain that you see in the upper right-hand corner. Right now, the difference is when blacks leave the South, they don't have those same Jim Crow laws uh, that are de facto, meaning they're by law. There are other types of segregation, but in the North and the West, there is a level of freedom that African Americans have. And the first question to answer, I could not hide the answer to it, is how are blacks moving out of the South to the North going to help jumpstart the civil rights movement? Well, the first step of why the civil rights movement will begin in the 1950s is that blacks can vote in the North. It creates voting blocks. They will live in an area of a city like South Central Los Angeles and LA, and they'll actually have their own black representatives in the House of Representatives as well as local governments. So this focuses the nation to focus on segregation in the South, because these people who moved out of the South still have family living in the South that are enduring the hardships of segregation. Now, another event that's going to help jumpstart the movement is going to be a need to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a court case that allowed segregation as long as facilities were separate but equal. Now, we all know that the separate part was enforced, but the equal part was not. And with this segregation, Emmett Till is a young African American child from Chicago who goes down in the South. And when he goes down in the South, he doesn't really understand the customs of segregation in the South. And he was murdered for whistling at a white woman. Now, the two brothers accused of killing Emmett, right, were found innocent in a court of law, even though Emmett's grand uncle testified in court that he saw the men take him from the house and was obvious that these guys did it. An all white jury found the men innocent. And then these men told a story about how they killed Emmett to a magazine, because the Fifth Amendment says you can't be tried for the same crime twice. Now, what I want you guys to do is answer, how does Emmett's murder spark the civil rights movement? How is this another event where African Americans say, we cannot live under the system anymore? This is where you can stop the video and answer the question. Now, the answer is that with these two white men being able to murder Emmett Till and get away with it, it basically said in the United States that black people, African Americans, do not have fair rights, that it's illegal to literally kill a person in the South, especially children. And for African Americans, how can you live in a system where people are allowed to kill you, right, to literally get away with murder? So the answer here, guys, is that blacks, whites can get away with murder in the South. And this system needs to change for African Americans. Now, if you can see in the upper right hand corner, that's actually Emmett Till's face after his murder and his disfigurement. And his mother wanted to make sure that people saw how bad he was treated in every parent in America, African American parent in America, especially, looked at it and said, that could be my own son too. We have to change that. Now, the first step in trying to overturn things was not through marches, was not through Martin Luther King and whatnot. It was actually legal methods. The NAACP for years had been using the courts to try to overturn segregation in the 1950s. Now, the gentleman you see in the middle of the screen, upper middle, top of the screen, is Thurgood Marshall. He was NAACP's leading attorney. And in the 30s and the 40s, he traveled throughout the South defending black rights in court. Now, if you can imagine the kind of bravery this took for a black person to travel the South and stand up in a court of law defending other black people when in the South, black people aren't even allowed to accuse white people of having committed a crime. And by the way, this is usually in front of an all white jury and certainly a white judge. Okay. Now, later, Thurgood Marshall is rewarded for his hard work by the President of the United States, President Lyndon Johnson, when he's made the first African American Supreme Court justice. But his importance in this case is Brown versus Board of Education. He is the lawyer that argued this case, right? And in this case, the plaintiff at hand was a young child who was forced to take a bus to an all black school across town, even though there was a white school right next to her. And it was argued that by forcing a young black child to take a bus somewhere else when there's a perfectly good school next to her, it created feelings of insecurity. And the idea here is in a country where we have segregation for adults, that's one thing. But when you're doing it to children, you're raising a whole generation to not feel confident about themselves. And also keep in mind at the same time, we're dealing with the Cold War. With the Cold War, communism doesn't care if you're white or black. They just care if you're rich or poor. And being that most African Americans are poor at this time, there was a fear that maybe African Americans would be attracted to communism because they would be judged less harshly or even at all for their skin color. Right. So, and the idea of raising a generation of Americans to feel that they're insecure might turn them into communists. Right. So this is a court case that ends segregation in school. Yay, victory. We're done. Everybody's going to go to the same school. But question number 3, does it? I mean, even today, guys, think about this. Does segregation still exist in schools today? Explain. This one you can stop it and write your answer. Now, the answer to that question is twofold. One, you could say no, Mr. Monica, it doesn't exist anymore because we all hang out together and we have lots of people that we know and all kinds of races mix and there's no law that says I can't go to the school that I want to go to. And you're right. That's called de facto segregation, where there's no law saying you can't go there. But there is something called de jure segregation. It's segregation by custom. Okay, looking around Lusinger, guys, there's no more legal segregation, but how many white kids go to Lusinger, and how many Latinos and African Americans go to Miracosta, right? So there's segregation today based on economic reasons. Also, how many times have you guys found yourself at lunch or people at lunch who hang out with their own groups because they just feel more comfortable with their own groups? And that's still something that goes about today. So is there still segregation today? De facto, no, it's not by law. De jure, yes, by custom, it's still around. Now, one of the first major events of the civil rights movement is the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This is the famous one that makes Martin Luther King civil rights leader, right? So keep this in mind. As I said, Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. It said that facilities can no longer be separate but equal. Now, it only related to schools. And keep in mind that Brown versus Board of Education did not end segregation. It still exists. And what's happening is blacks are being forced to sit in the back of the bus. Now, the question here, and unfortunately the answer came up again, Why is it so particularly unfair to force black people to sit in the back of the bus? Well, the reason why is because white people don't ride the bus. They have cars. It's blacks who need to use the bus. So it's kind of like a double put down, like, hey, not only are you forced to ride the bus, but we'll tell you exactly where you're going to sit on the bus. So you would have the bus full of African Americans in the back of the bus. Meanwhile, the front of the bus was empty because there's no whites on the bus. Now, it all begins with Rosa Parks. She is a 43-year-old civil rights advocate for the NAACP. She was not just a little old lady coming home from work one day and she felt tired. Okay. This was not an accident, right? She was chosen to be the face of this movement, right? So she refused to move from her seat in the front of the bus. She was jailed and fined $14. Now you might say, oh, well, it's $14. Well, $14 in money back then would be about $90 a day. So imagine paying $90 because you sat in the wrong seat, right? Now, why do you think Rosa Parks was chosen to be the lightning rod to start this boycott? Go ahead and stop the video, answer that question. And the answer here is, she's a very non-threatening individual. I mean, all she is a regular, she could be a mother, she could be your aunt, she could be any person. She's a professional. She's dressed very, very nicely. You know what? And she's not a criminal. So why is this person being arrested as if she's a criminal? Well, all she did was sit at the front of the bus. So it's showing like how unfair the law is to judge people based on race rather than there's nothing here about her that is actually threatening to anybody. Now, the boycott. What happened was this is the blacks stopped riding the bus and instead what they did is they carpool to get around, right? Now, Martin Luther King is brought in to be the central organizer of the boycott. And the important thing about Martin Luther King is the importance is here is that blacks use churches as a central organizing apparatus for this boycott, right? The church to African Americans isn't just a place of worship. It was the one institution that blacks owned and they felt comfortable and they trusted everyone there. Everybody goes there. So it's not just a place of worship, it's a social gathering place for people to go to, right? And by using the church, Martin Luther King was able to get his message across to everybody in town. And in church, when he said, hey, we're all going to stop riding the bus, everybody at church would look at everyone else at church and say, yeah, we're all doing this. Because if you ride the bus and we see you at church on Sunday, you're going to hear it from all of us. And what's important about this is it was ordinary people in this instance that committed to create change. Right now, think about this at this time. The question: who do people, who most people depend on for help if they are treated unfairly, and why do you think blacks felt the need to make this change for themselves? Or another way of asking it is, in this case, blacks are turned to the church for help. Normally, who do people turn to for help, and why did blacks not turn to this institution? You can stop and answer the question. Now, the answer is people usually turn to the government. But the problem in this case is that the federal government is ignoring black rights in the South, and the state governments are owned by whites because blacks can't vote in the South. So turning to the government will not help African Americans earn their equal rights. Now, some of the tactics of white resistance that they use to stop the boycott. One, if you're a carpooler and you were carpooling people, you could have your car insurance canceled. Martin Luther King's bomb sorry, Martin Luther King's house was bombed. Now, Martin Luther King was not in the house at the time. You can see that in the upper right hand corner, but his wife and child were. Okay. Also, black leaders were arrested for organizing an illegal boycott. Now, think about this. What is so backwards about some of the techniques above that whites use to try and stop the Montgomery bus boycott? Pick one of those and think why whites are backwards in enforcing those kinds of rules to stop the boycott. Go ahead and stop it, ask a question. Now, the answer to this is obviously car insurance cancel for carpoolers. Well, this is an environmental thing that we encourage people to do today to keep people off of the road. So they wanted more cars on the road for more individuals. Doesn't make sense in today's environment. Martin Luther King's house being bombed. I mean, that's just straight violence by the Klan or whatever white groups intending to harm someone, and it could have harmed his family. And black leaders arrested for organizing an illegal boycott. A boycott is when people refuse to buy something. How do you have an illegal refusal to buy something? I'm not going to ride the bus anymore. You can't force me to ride the bus. But that's somehow the illegal to organize people to not want to ride the bus anymore. Now, in November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was illegal. And keep this in mind, the boycott lasted for 1 year. And what's so important about this, guys, is for a whole year, people who needed the bus more than any other source of transportation had to walk or find another way. And it was ordinary people in this instance that created the change that happened. Now, from this incident, this is where Martin Luther King found international fame. It made him a star. So we get the beginning of Martin Luther King. Okay. Now, the thing about Martin Luther King, though, that makes him different than other civil rights leaders is his strategies and visions for civil rights. And it's the reason why we respect him and we have a holiday for him and not so much Malcolm X or Medgar Evers or Stokely Carmichael or other leaders of the civil rights movement, right? Now, the first idea that he had is he had his I Have a Dream. Now, the I Have a Dream speech that you see above occurs well after the Montgomery bus boycott in the early 60s. But in his message of I Have a Dream, he's saying that all people are equal, and he wanted an end to segregation. But the thing about it was he doesn't want to punish segregationists. He's just trying to remind Americans that all my dream is for African Americans is to have the same rights in the Declaration of Independence that have been written into American ideas since the beginning of this country: equality, inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right. So he's not a threat to white Northerners, and they supported him. He's not telling white people you're wrong for doing this. He's just saying, hey, can we please get the rights that have always been enshrined in this nation? So answer these two questions. I'll give you the answer in a second, but just think about this. Why do you think whites supported Martin Luther King? And why was it so important to get whites to support the civil rights movement? This is where you can stop it. Think about your answer. Now, the reason why whites supported Martin Luther King and not Malcolm X is he's not threatening. People can look at him and say, you know what? You're right. Why do African Americans not have the basic rights that I believe all people should have? It's what I've talked about with like gay marriage before in this classroom. When people think about that and say, hey, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, why is one group not allowed to get married when everyone else is going to get married? So white people could identify with this and say, okay, that sounds simple enough. Give people equal rights. And number two, the reason why it was so important to get whites to support the civil rights movement was because we are a democracy. And in a democracy, you have to win elections. And African Americans only make up about 12% of the population. In some southern states, they're more than 50%. But in a national election with the president of the United States, you need white people to want to support equal rights for black people and make sure that legislators are going to make laws that will protect rights for blacks in the South. So the only way that really gets done is when white people go to the polls and say, yes, I too agree that African Americans should have equal rights. Now, another reason why Martin Luther King is remembered is his ideas of nonviolent, peaceful protests. You're going to see in other videos that this is going to be a theme of the civil rights movement. Okay. And it was one of the most effective tools when on television you had African American activists being beaten by groups of whites and they're not fighting back. Right. And this form of peaceful protest gave civil rights activists a moral authority. Right. It made the segregationists look like the aggressors. It made the segregationists look un-American, right? And keep us in mind about he's talking about peace. He's talking about peace before the hippies were talking about peace or the Vietnam War. But he's ahead of the curve on this peace movement, right? And both these two ideas, they rewrote race relations in America. Now, an interesting thing though, when he's talking about, hey, peace and love, like you have Gandhi in the upper right-hand corner, which is the person that Martin Luther King got this idea from, is evaluate if nonviolence is an effective way to get your point across. Think, would nonviolence have worked against Hitler? Why did nonviolence work in the United States in creating change? Go ahead and stop the video and think about that. Now, nonviolence, here's the answer. Nonviolence is an effective way to get your point across if you're dealing with a population that has human qualities, right? That can empathize with people. Gandhi worked because his protests were against the English, and the English are civilized, right? The problem is nonviolence wouldn't work against Hitler because they already had a point of view that Some people were superior to other people, and subhumans did not deserve the same rights of them. So if you try to use nonviolence against Hitler, he just say, fine, I'm going to shoot you in the head or I'm going to kill you anyways, like he did with all the Jews, right? But the reason why nonviolence works in the United States and it created change because America, in the Declaration of Independence, right, does believe in certain ideas of equality. And yes, there are racist people in this nation, and there is a Klan and whatnot, and there were people dedicated to trying to keep down the rights of African Americans. But the overall majority of Americans believe in the ideals of this nation. So when you have a population that believes in equality for all at some level, when you use nonviolence, that gets across to people and they will advocate and ask for change. Now, the last incident we're going to talk about for today. Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Now, keep this in mind. Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation in schools. Yay. But the problem in the South is integrating as slowly as possible. This is 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, right? And high schools still are not integrating. And keep in mind what we said in the 1950s about the importance of high school. High schools are these huge populations where all students get together, right? They're no longer these small little schools that people only in a small area go to. It's a whole region of the city going there. So you have African Americans who live in this local area not being allowed to go to their local high school, right? So you have the Little Rock Nine. Now, who are they? In the upper left-hand corner, you can see them. And they are 9 Black students who are to enroll at Central High School. They were selected based on their academic excellence to be the first people to go there, right? Now, when they were called to go to school, the governor of Arkansas, Governor Faubus, he called in the National Guard to keep the students out. Now, the first day of school, when they were set to arrive, there were white mobs out in front, and all the students were called not to go to school that day, except for you can see in the left lower corner there, Elizabeth Eckford. She didn't have a phone. So she showed up at school that day, and when she showed up, she was greeted by the mobs. Everybody saw this. The television cameras are there, and thousands of angry whites jeered at the students, and television captured the scene and made the nation sensitive to civil rights. When this appeared on television and the verbal brutality that Elizabeth was enduring, Americans outside of the South basically called up their congressmen, called up their senators, called the president of the United States and said, Mr. President, you have to do something about that. This is not fair that students who want to get an education can't get an education. So Eisenhower reacted by sending in the U.S. Airborne, 101st Airborne, who were the people that landed at D-Day, okay, to protect the students for a whole year. They showed up with tanks, bayonets, machine guns, the whole thing. And the historical significance of the president getting involved to protect the Little Rock Nine here, the answer is already there, guys, is this is the first time the federal government has gotten involved to help blacks in the South since 1877. To a lot of Southerners, they felt that the North had invaded them again. But now you're starting to see for the very first time another change happening in the civil rights movement is the federal government's getting involved to protect rights in the South. Now, Eisenhower didn't do too much more, but this is the beginning of something, and a little bit of something is better than a lot of nothing. Okay. That's it for my lecture for today, guys. So can you please take the questions, the 11 questions that you guys have written on the left side? Can you post that on the Google Doc and turn that into me today? Also, hopefully you already watched the video from the 1950s that went along with this lecture. If you haven't seen it yet, watch it now, answer those questions too. Otherwise, if you have, hopefully that helped you guys out, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.